For 30 plus years, I've spent my life trying to understand how does a leader become an effective global leader. Then it was how do you effectively become a change leader. Then it was an innovation leader. Today it's digital transformation. And whether it was interviewing A.G. Lafley way back before he ever became the CEO of Procter & Gamble for my global leadership work, or up to the present interviewing Michael Dell for the Innovator's DNA, or Jeff Bezos for Questions of the Answer, all of these people throughout that 30 years were exceptional at asking questions. And they didn't just ask questions for questions' sake. They did it because they wanted to make a difference, and they knew that questions were a key that unlocked doors other people couldn't get through. So that's the frame from which I'm coming at questions, that they are the answer when you get the right question. I'd like to start just for a moment a little bit closer to your world. In Nepal, in the Himalayas, this was 2015. For 10 years, I had been teaching a case study with David Brashears, who was the director, the cinematographer, the team leader for the team that made the IMAX Everest film. And he also has climbed Everest 5 times. He's done numerous scientific expeditions at high altitude with teams. And I had taught a case study written by Harvard about a 1996 disaster on Mount Everest. I'd taught it for years. And David and I were talking one day about why don't we do a research project at base camp, interviewing all of the people contributing to helping people get to the top. Not just the guides, but the Sherpas, the porters, the cooks, the assistant cooks, everybody. I ended up coming up after David to base camp, and on the way got horrifically sick because I didn't quite know what I didn't know, and I wasn't doing some things I should have done. I ended up being able to go up into the Khumbu Icefall above base camp. This is a picture of me on the left and Phula Sherpa on the right. You got Mount Pamori behind me at about 24,000 feet. We're at about 19,000 feet. And shortly after this photo was taken, I was so ill that I was flown out. And 3 days later was the avalanche from the earthquake in 2015 that literally flattened my tent. And I may have been dead had I stayed. And so in one sense, getting sick was a tender mercy. I'm very grateful for it. The reason I'm sharing this is the following. I learned through that experience powerfully. It's one thing to talk about leadership, and it's another thing to do it. It's one thing to talk about being on Mount Everest and being gasping for air, or even near there. It's another thing to be at 19,000 feet and wondering if you're going to be alive tomorrow. I try every time that I work with leaders like you to remember that moment, to remember that I have something to learn as we look at some ideas around how do we do this thing we call leadership better. So with that, I'd like to now launch into the world of inquiry and questioning as a leader. You've been on a quest. You've been doing this program while we're in the midst of a pandemic crisis and trying to keep everything going at work and home and beyond. And I really mean what I'm saying. I teach the executive MBAs at MIT who are working full-time, coming on weekends to school, and I admire them for what they do. But we're in a moment now where doing this kind of a leadership development program in the midst of a pandemic is truly an amazing thing that you've done, and I hope you feel that sort of reward internally for doing it. It's a quest. My hunch is you've actually learned how to ask better questions. You're not alone. If you go way back to the beginning of Dell, in the 1990s, Clayton Christensen, Jeff Dyer, and I interviewed him for the book, The Innovator's DNA. And he explained to us the obvious question that created Dell, which was, why does this computer get sold in the 1990s and 1980s? Why does this computer get sold for 5 times the cost of the parts? Which seems like a simple question, but it ended up changing the entire value chain and building a company that was a juggernaut, and is. And so it makes a difference in the world. These questions create new industries and new opportunities. We also asked Michael back then, do you have any questions that are really helpful that you ask over and over again to figure things out? And he laughed and he said, if I did that, people would know the answer, quote unquote, to my question. And he told us that I like to ask people things that they don't think that I'm going to ask them, questions that nobody has the answer to yet. It's an interesting way of looking at the world. And my hunch is, if I were in your role dealing with him today, I bet he still does that just as well as he did a few decades ago. What I'm trying to help us learn together is how can we all become better at asking these sorts of questions that don't just tilt the way we're looking at the world, but make it better. And what I find really intriguing is to ask folks all over the world, we all know asking the right questions matters, but how do you do that? If I were to wake up tomorrow, what would I do differently than I do today to ask a better question, to get unstuck, to move things forward? Undoubtedly, you've heard of Clayton Christensen. He's a good friend and colleague and unfortunately passed away earlier this year. But when I asked Clay this question, he literally, he said, Hal, sit in this chair. And he got a chair and he put me in it and he said, look, this is how I look at the world. What forces outside of a leader are causing them to do or to not do things? And so his way of thinking about this is what conditions, what causal mechanisms outside of me are causing me to ask the questions I otherwise wouldn't ask. He also shared with me that when he was getting his MBA in his early 30s at Harvard, which is a case study sort of method, every day they'd have several cases. And at the beginning of his program, other students were asking questions he didn't even consider. And he's like, how did they get to that question? So here's what he did. You can imagine, everybody's already working hard to prepare 3 or 4 more cases for the next day. But at the end of the day, every day, Clay would step back, go back to the old cases from that day, go back to the questions that he didn't ask that others did that really changed the conversation. And he would reverse engineer the question to figure out, how did they get there? Mm-hmm. That's a disciplined approach to figuring out how do you ask the better question. And what I'm trying to suggest here is the following, is these leaders that I interviewed, like Clay, they were systematic and thoughtful about what are the conditions that cause me to ask the better question. So let me share a framework that I find really valuable here. It's really thinking, how do I compose the conditions for the questions to come? And these are the conditions that I learned actually from a photographer. Way back, I used to be a professional wedding and portrait photographer when I was in college, paid my way through college. Later in life, about 6 years ago, I met Sam Abel, who's a 30-year National Geographic veteran. I was doing a mentorship workshop with him. We were in Santa Fe, end of 3 days, and Sam sent us on an assignment to downtown Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the western part of the United States. I was sitting there waiting for something interesting to happen, and then all these cars pulled up, old and new. It was a car show, didn't expect it coming. I was intrigued by that car in the middle, the yellow old one, got up behind it. It was a hot day. Santa Fe's in a desert sort of arena, very warm. I'm starting to take photographs. I'm trying to get something interesting through that front window. I'm literally composed and was waiting for something to happen. 67 photos later, nothing really compelling was going on. I was all sweaty. Literally, my eyeglasses broke because I was pressing them so hard on the camera. And then I heard a voice from behind me say, "You might get better photos if you're inside the car. Would you like to get in?" I was stunned. It was the owner of the car. He was letting me in. I honestly believe if I had not been committed to his car for 10 or 15 minutes, he never would have let me in. I got inside, totally different view, put on a wider angle lens, tried to keep that top and bottom line composed right in the middle of the frame, and then just sat still and tight in a very narrow, uncomfortable backseat. That's the point at which this guy shows up. He's like, what are you doing back in there? And then he sticks his head in a little further, and I'm trying to hold the composition. And then he says, do you come with the car? He laughed. I laughed. It was one of those perfect compose and wait moments. This photo looks inevitable. It's like it just happened. But it was made through a logic of, I'm going to compose a setting and I'm going to sit and wait for something interesting to happen. It doesn't always work, but more often than not, it works really well. Compose and wait. I'd like you to think those three words when you think of questions. We lived in London, compose and wait on the streets of London. Recently was in Hong Kong, compose and wait at the highest restaurant in the world, over 100 floors up in the air. Here nearby, we live north of Boston, in the eastern part of the United States, compose and wait. That photo was 20 minutes in the making on a freezing day, but everything had to be just right for it to work. But it's the same thing Clayton Christensen was telling me, and it's the same thing 200 other leaders were telling me, and these were the conditions they were in. They would systematically, intentionally, daily often, put themselves in a setting with a person or a place that would cause them to rethink their mental map because they were dead wrong about something. And sometimes when our map gets challenged, our way of looking at the world, and it's a fundamental challenge of an assumption, it's really uncomfortable. And the instinctual response at that point is to run and avoid it for most of us. But if we don't and capture some reflective quiet, there's a high probability questions will come that will open up doors that otherwise will stay locked. These are the habits. That's an organizational example with a leader who started and drove it. But let's go through 3 or 4 habits and do 1 or 2 of their habits live on a real challenge that you care about. So here's the first habit. Many of these leaders were actually very aware of the questions they were asking. So if you've never done it before, take 24 hours when the goal program today is over. Take 24 hours during the next week. Audit all of your questions, incoming, outgoing, and look at it the next day. It'll be fascinating to see what are the patterns and questions that are coming in and going out. This is exactly what Clay Christensen did when I talked about it earlier when he was in college, and he did it every day. Habit number 2. You're showing up on a Zoom meeting now. Someday it's going to be live again. Default to ask, not tell when you walk into a room, virtual or live. Default to ask. Orit Gadish, chairman of Bain Consulting, grew up in Israel, had parents who were very supportive of her questions. She always asked questions when teachers asked if there were questions. Her junior high school teacher wrote in her yearbook, Orit always asked those 2 or 3 questions. When Orit was hired as an early 20-year-old at Bain Consulting, that's the way in which she thrived, was what's working, what's not, and why not, and how might. She is a non-stop questioner. She defaults to ask in a room, not to tell, even when she's the chairman of the company. Third skill. Sometimes it's incredibly helpful to do recursive questions. So hold tight. I'm going to grab something. This is not planned. I'm coming back. That statement comes from a book that a friend of mine, Ed Catmull, who's the co-founder of Pixar. The book's about Coco. And what that says is good questions are recursive. You know, he's got a PhD in computer science, and you know what recursive is. You know, you're doing it over and over. It's like, it's valuable. And so here's the point. If you go to a company like Keyence Corporation, which may well be a supplier of equipment for Dell Computer, I suspect it is. I had never heard of Keyence. They're number 38 in 2018 on the most innovative companies in the world. They sell boring, in one sense, B2B business stuff from one company to another, sensors to make factory environments work better. And they every day ask this question inside and outside of the organization: why are we even doing this? Now that may seem disruptive. I get it. But at the very core, they're doing it not to be clever and look good. They're doing it to find and solve problems. That's why they ask that over and over, and they deliver exceptional results. The fourth habit is crafting questions that are catalytic to the context you're in. Here's the situation. I'm in a context, I'm stuck, and I've got to figure out a new question that will unstick me, that'll get me unlocked. 20 years ago, you probably read about it in the Better Brainstorming article. I'm in a situation where we're trying to figure out gender inequity, we're stuck. I don't know what to do. I'm leading the group of leaders in the conversation. I say, wait a minute, let's ask nothing but questions about the issue. We did that, no answers to the questions, no explanations about why we're asking them. We literally filled, I remember, all of the boards, the chalkboards in the room with questions in about 15 minutes. The energy level went from negative to positive. We reframed the issue, and we had many different possible new directions we could go. Since then, I've used that question burst method with thousands, 20,000 plus leaders around the world. And 85% of the time, asking nothing but questions, as odd as it may seem, actually can move us forward in making progress.